My name is Nathan Caldwell, and this story has been passed down from generation to generation in my family. It all started with my great-grandfather, Henry Caldwell, who in 1923 was working as a janitor at the old St. Michael's Church in Millfield, a small mining town in Colorado. He and his two companions, Joe and Elias, were the handymen of the place, cleaning, repairing, and sometimes helping with the ceremonies. But among the residents there was a rumor that the church was not empty. Many said that she hid presences that were not in the records. Henry always laughed at these stories until he witnessed them with his own eyes. Next to the church, the cemetery housed graves dating back to the time of the Civil War. Among the graves, one stood out, that of Colonel Asa Buchanan. According to the ancients, he was a cruel man, known for punishing deserters in a brutal manner. They said that even after he was buried, his spirit did not rest. During the night, some people claimed to hear the sound of his wooden leg scraping the earth, a hollow noise that mixed with the wind. Henry never believed these stories until he began to notice something strange at sunset. At that time, the routine of the three janitors was simple. During the day, they carried out their tasks without problems, but at night, something changed. Henry reported that always at the same time, shadows moved between the tombstones. First, they seemed to sway in the wind. Then they became sharper, until on a cold autumn night he saw what appeared to be a man marching slowly through the cemetery. He wore a shabby uniform, and as he walked, he left a characteristic sound on the ground, the dragging of a wooden leg. The scariest thing was that sometimes he would stop, look around, and shout orders to soldiers who weren't there. One day, Joe and Elias swore they had seen the colonel do something impossible. He stopped before a tombstone, drew his rusty sword. Without hesitation, he stood up and began to fight against nothingness. The sound of the sword echoed through the cemetery, but the next morning, there was no sign or impact of it anywhere. Henry tried to find some logical explanation for it, but couldn't. Then he realized that it wasn't just the cemetery that kept secrets. Inside the church, something even more terrifying awaited them. In the central part, a figure dressed in a black habit appeared without warning. Elijah was the first to see her. He was blowing out the candles on the altar when, as he turned around, he noticed the nun standing in the back aisle. The strange thing was that she didn't make any noise. It was simply there. As Elijah approached, he realized that under the veil there was no face, only a dark void. Dread seized him, and before he could scream, all the candles went out at once, and an icy wind swept through the church. But what scared him the most was the sound that came later. The sound Elijah heard was low at first, almost like a whisper. But then it grew, taking over the church. It was a murmur of voices in Latin, tangled, as if several people were praying at the same time. But there was something wrong. The words were too quick, without pauses, and the tone was not prayerful. It sounded like a lamentation. Elijah staggered away and stumbled on the steps of the altar. When she managed to get up, the nun was no longer there. But the echo of the voices persisted, as if the walls were still impregnated with that sound. From that night on, Henry and his friends began to notice changes in the church. Objects moved without explanation. The doors creaked even without wind. And with each new day, marks appeared on the candles, as if nails had been dragged by them while they were still soft. But the worst happened in the basement. During the 1850s, that space had served as a shelter for runaway slaves. Some say that many did not survive. Perhaps that was why every night Henry heard noises coming from there, noises that did not belong to living people. The basement was below the sacristy, accessible by a door reinforced with old locks. Once, Joe decided to investigate alone, believing that it could be rats or another animal. He went down with an oil flashlight and stayed there for a few minutes. When he returned, his face was livid, and he said not a word. Henry and Elias insisted that he tell what he had seen, but he only shook his head. That night, he had such an intense nightmare that he woke up screaming. The next day, he left the city without warning. He was never seen again. Without Joe, Henry and Elias had to handle the job alone. But things only got worse. The cemetery seemed to take on a life of its own. During a morning inspection, Henry noticed that the soil of some ancient graves was turned over, as if something had moved underneath. The most frightening thing was the mark of a hand imprinted on the damp earth. Still, Henry refused to believe that anything other than the natural was happening, but that changed on a full moon night. Elijah was closing the gates of the church when he suddenly stopped. His gaze was fixed on the cemetery. Henry followed her gaze and froze. Over a newly opened ditch, the faceless nun was standing, but she was not alone. Beside him, Colonel Buchanan stood like a statue, his empty eyes staring directly at the two men. And then, without warning, the nun raised her arm and pointed at them. At the same instant, the earth from the pit began to move. Something was trying to get out of there. Henry could never explain exactly what he saw that night. He only remembered the desperation of running into the church, locking the doors and praying that it would stay outside. Elias, on the other hand, could not stand the pressure. The next day he resigned and left. Henry, as scared as he was, decided to stay. But he knew he wouldn't last long there. The next night was even worse. Henry was alone in the barracks, trying to convince himself that it was all imagination. But around 3 in the morning, he heard heavy footsteps on the wooden floor. First, just 1 or 2, then a cadenced gait, as if several boots were stepping on at the same time. The sound came from the side corridor, which led to the basement. With trembling hands, he picked up the flashlight and followed the noise. Suddenly, the sound ceased. But before he could breathe a sigh of relief, he felt an icy breath on the back of his neck. He sprang around and saw the cellar door ajar, dark as the mouth of a tunnel. Henry approached her and closed. The smell that rose from below was strong, a mixture of mold and something else, something rotten. As soon as he got up, a door behind him closed with a bang. His flashlight flashed, and then he listened. A cry, a low wail coming from the darkest corner. Henry felt his body freeze. But what really made him want to run away was the next sound, a slow drag, as if something was moving towards him. The light of the lantern flickered, and for a moment Henry saw it. First, just a huge shadow leaning against the brick wall. Then the outlines of what appeared to be a hunched man, with arms too long for his body. The fingers stretched, scraping against the stone floor. When the flashlight flashed once more, the face of the thing revealed itself. And Henry wished he had never been there. It was a human face, but distorted, as if it was being sucked into itself. The eyes were sunken and empty. Henry screamed and ran away, kicking the door with all his might. It snapped open and he fell into the barracks. The flashlight rolled across the floor, illuminating the door for an extra second, and it was enough for him to see. The thing was still there, standing at the doorway, but the most terrible thing was to realize that she was smiling, a wide smile which did not match his deformed face. Before Henry could react, the door closed on its own, sealing the creature outside. In the following days, he tried to ignore everything that had happened, pretending that none of it was real. But every time he passed through the corridor, he smelled a rotten smell escaping through the cracks in the door. And sometimes, in the silence of the night, he could still hear the scratches. As if something was waiting for him to come back, he held out for a few more weeks, but stress began to take its toll on him. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale. He slept little, and when he did, he dreamed of the face of the thing in the basement. One night, he woke up in a cold sweat, convinced that someone was in his room. But when he turned on the light, there was no one there, just mud footprints on the floor, starting next to the bed and ending at the door. The final straw came on his last night in church. Henry was finishing locking the doors when he heard a noise in the cemetery, a shuffling creak followed by heavy footsteps in the soft earth. He didn't want to go look, but something made him go, and there he was, Colonel Buchanan, standing among the tombstones. His empty eyes shone in the moonlight, and then he raised his hand, pointing directly at Henry. Time seemed to stop. Henry felt a crushing weight on his chest, as if invisible hands were pushing him to the ground. His knees gave way and he fell face down, swallowing dust. The last thing he saw before he lost consciousness was the silhouette of the colonel, slowly moving towards him, dragging his wooden leg on the dry ground. The next morning, Henry woke up inside the church. I didn't know how I had gotten there. His body ached as if he had been trampled on, but the worst thing was to realize that his clothes were covered with dirt, as if he had spent the night lying in a grave. He didn't wait to understand. He took his few things and left that place that same morning. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He just took the money from the settlement. He never went back there. And even years later, whenever he talked about those nights, his voice trembled. He could never tell if what happened was a nightmare, a delirium, or something much worse. Henry lived a long and quiet life after leaving that place, but he could never forget those nights. Whenever he talked about it, his expression changed, as if reliving every detail. He wasn't the type to make up stories or exaggerate, and what happened in that place marked him deeply. His eyes, already tired with age, were always distant when he mentioned the colonel, the faceless nun, or the thing in the basement. It was as if, at that moment, he was back to being the young janitor who had almost lost his sanity in that cursed place. My grandfather grew up hearing this story. As a child, he hid behind his father's chair while Henry recounted every detail, and even as an adult, he never doubted what he heard. He always said that the old man's eyes did not lie. The fear that transpired there was not the fear of those who dreamed or imagined something, but the real dread of those who survived something that should not exist. My father was never a scared man, he used to say. But when he spoke of the church, even his voice trembled. I first heard this story when I was 14 years old. My grandfather gathered us around the fireplace on a stormy night and told everything, word for word, as his father told him. I remember the strange sensation I felt that night, a shiver that didn't come from the cold wind outside, but from the images my mind created. I could see Henry in the darkness of the church, hearing the colonel's footsteps, smelling the rotting smell of the basement, and seeing that faceless nun standing before the crucifix. It was as if his story had become mine too. Over time, I heard this story dozens of times. My grandfather never changed a single detail. He repeated each scene with the same intensity, as if he needed to keep his father's memory alive. Whenever he got to the colonel's part pointing to Henry in the cemetery, he would pause, take a deep breath and look at us, as if to make sure we were paying attention. That thing wanted him to stay, he said, but my father had the courage to leave. Those words made me think for years about what would have happened if my great-grandfather had stayed. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I find myself thinking about it. No matter how many years pass, the story still gives me goosebumps. It's not just because of fear, but because of the weight she carries. My great-grandfather survived something that accompanied him until the last day of his life. He didn't speak of it as a legend or a tale to scare children, but as a painful memory, an invisible scar that never went away. My grandfather always says that the only thing Henry regretted was that he didn't leave that place sooner, because he knew something stayed there waiting for him to come back. The Church of San Miguel no longer exists, but that doesn't mean that what happened there has disappeared. The walls were torn down, the altar turned into rubble, but the floor, the cemetery, the basement, everything is still there. My grandfather always says that there are places where time doesn't follow the same rules that we know. Places where things that happened leave deep marks, impossible to erase. And for Henry, that church was one of those places. Even after it was destroyed, he knew that voices still whispered in the dark, and that somewhere in the cemetery, the earth still stirred from time to time. Every time my grandfather talks about this story, he ends the same way. He closes his eyes for a moment, sighs deeply, and says, "It doesn't matter what you believe, but if you ever go to Millfield, never walk alone through the cemetery." I always thought it was just a way to increase the mystery of the story, but as I grew older, I realized that it wasn't that. He truly believes that this place left something behind, something that should not be disturbed. And after so many years of hearing this story, I believe it too. I've thought about visiting Millfield, not to challenge what my grandfather says, but to see what is left of that place. But every time I imagine myself stepping on that ground, I feel a strange weight in my chest, as if something told me I shouldn't go. I'm not superstitious, I never have been, but I'm not naive either. If my great-grandfather lived the rest of his life running away from that place, I have no reason to look for him. People may think that this story is just an exaggeration told for generations, but I know my grandfather. I know he never added a single detail to make the story scarier. He tells exactly what he heard from his father, and I know he believes every word. When I look into his eyes as he speaks, I see the same thing Henry saw in the mirror every time he thought of church. Fear. Not a ghost, not a legend, but something real. Something that touched her family in a way that can never be erased. I never asked my grandfather if he thinks the Colonel is still there, but I think I already know the answer. If he didn't believe it, he wouldn't be so careful in telling this story. I wouldn't have spent so many years repeating the same warnings, the same words. He talks about it as someone who knows that somewhere it still exists. Even if no one else sees it, even if the city has forgotten, the story remains. Because some things don't die. My grandfather always says that the worst thing Henry saw in that church wasn't the Colonel or the nun or the thing in the basement. It was fear itself. Because fear makes us doubt reality. It makes us question our own sanity. And Henry lived with this doubt for the rest of his life. Maybe that's why he told this story so many times. Maybe he wanted to make sure that it really happened, that he wasn't crazy. I've never seen anything supernatural. I have never heard voices. I have never felt strange presences. But this story taught me something. There are things we can't explain. And just because we can't see them doesn't mean they're not there. Maybe that's why this story keeps being told. Maybe that's why, whenever we hear it, we feel a chill running down our spine, as if something is watching us from the other side of the darkness. Whatever happened in the Church of St. Michael, it stayed there. He didn't follow my great-grandfather. He didn't persecute our family. But he remains on that piece of land, hoping that someone will have the courage to return. And if someday someone comes back, I hope they know what they're doing. Because my great-grandfather got out of that place alive, but I don't know if anyone else would be as lucky. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel.